Their only hope was to make it to the bridge somehow. There would be a way to access his life support. But whoever this massive tree was, it had turned his beloved Yolopile into a winding and obscene disfigurement that was soon to be his tomb. The abyss chirped and broke Deicide out of his morose trance. Her considerable loss of size had also turned her usual chorus of feminine voices to a single mouse-like squeak. Deicide nodded and headed back into the office complex. His hands began to tremble, and the beating of his heart quickened. It was the beginnings of the Eater's curse. A hunger which would eat away at his mind until Deicide and the abyss were desperately struggling not to consume each other. Once the sickness had reached the end of this maddening plummet, normal food would be impossible to keep down, and any ability to hold a rational thought in his head would drift away. As Deicide walked through the dimly lit amanuensis alley, he could smell the ancient death. The Yolopile was already a grave to the majority, and naturally, he was worried about the circumstances of those that had survived this disaster, if any. He peeked through the spattered and cracked cubicles which housed each of the secretaries. The well-preserved half-skeletons of the women still sat in their stations, seeming as if they were ready at any moment to return to work. Deicide saw the umbilical plugs running from their skulls and into their stations still looked as new as ever. He fought the urge to look closer. The legless woman had always been a mystery to him, and he lamented the fact that he was never able to meet them. He wondered what they thought of him, and the goals he had set out for himself. They being privy to his thoughts, he could not imagine them being any worse than Not, who had always remained a sympathetic skeptic, whatever that meant. He turned the corner passing his wife's office, fighting the urge to burst in. He knew she was more than likely not present, but he had no desire to see her in such a way, if she was. He stopped when he saw the large route split up through the atrium between their offices. They led into the study, and into the physical archival library that Not had been so emphatic on preserving. Paper, all of it, a waste of space, especially the machines used to manufacture it, printing new revisions every few years. But he did love lounging in the library, on an idle holiday routine. As he passed the great shelves, he saw that some of the books were still intact, though he knew they would probably disintegrate if he tried to pull one away, or even breathe too forcefully near them. He passed through the library, and into his private war memorial, dedicated to his greatest of enemies. The Hall of Heroes, he called it, cathedral-like. It housed works of art depicting those who were worthy enough to be called a nemesis. The overgrowth had savagely conquered this space as well. The roots had ravaged the hall, splitting and fracturing seemingly endless frescoes that adorned the ceilings. Pairs of statues were widowed, as their companion pieces were pulverized after eons of encroachment by the roots of this damnable tree yet to be seen. As he made his way to the center of this massive space, he saw that his centerpiece had been filled. A great statue of an Alberonian woman towered over him. Though damaged, she still retained a cynical smirk. Deicide looked down to the engraving beneath her feet. "Fauna Dearborn," a voice said. Deicide turned toward the voice, just as a figure emerged from the shoulder of his massive statue. A man with chalky white hair, skin the color of a pearl. Deicide could see vaguely familiar symbols had been carved into his skin, and then they came to him. All were scratched out, except for one, Deicide. Deicide narrowed his eyes as the man began to slam his fists together. The abyss withdrew inside Deicide's shirt as the man leaped from the statue, cracking the stone floor beneath him upon his landing. "What happened here?" Deicide said. "You got your way," the man said, and lunged toward Deicide. Unable to avoid the swipes, the man's fingers dug deep into Deicide's chest. Deicide spun away from his attacker as his skin was torn from his body. The two remained still after the short exchange. Deicide was unsure exactly how much energy he could afford to use, but soon the man gave him no choice. The two locked grips, and the man pulled Deicide toward him, with his edged teeth bared. "Who are you?" Deicide said, snatching his arms away. "Last ancestor of your centerpiece." "Arcadir," he said. "I've never met that woman," Deicide said. "You will, and once you do, the war will break out into what you see here," Arcadir said. Quickly grabbing Deicide's neck, he rammed his head into Deicide's. The two became intertwined, desperately scratching and biting for position. Deicide could feel his muscles begin to lock up as they scuffled in the dust. Arcadir wrenched himself away and kicked the downed Deicide viciously. He produced a knife from some sleight of hand and stood over Deicide, heaving, grinning through a scowl as he stepped on the side of Deicide's face. For a moment, Deicide wanted to let it happen. In a single day, his wife, family, and friends, and his empire had all withered away. This end would be far less painful than the wicked contortion this eater's sickness would put him through. As his digestive fluids reached unheard-of acidity levels, the enzymes in his stomach would slip through the ulcers caused by the churning bile and consume him from within. With a boot in his jowl, Deicide craned his head desperately to look into the eyes of his executioner. He had expected the eyes of a monster, only to find those of a survivor, a lucky scavenger who had managed to outlive the wolves. Yes, as long as Deicide breathed, the wolf god would live. Deicide remembered being lectured by Iker as a child. To him, free will was exercised only when one took control of their life. So much of Deicide's own life had been directed by the guidelines of another. His twisted mission to slaughter the pretender god was not his revenge, and in an instant he was disgusted with himself. It was the weak who should offer their throats to him. It was they who had to purchase their time in this world with ties of blood. At the very least, Deicide would make sure he was the only soul remaining when the lights of this world were extinguished. Arkadair plunged the blade into the man's stomach, but was surprised when Deicide rolled from underneath his boot. His sharp fingers tore into the man's calves and peeled the meat away from his shins. When he had fallen, Deicide rose and snatched the blade from his stomach. As the abyss chirped and plugged the wound, when Deicide engaged with the man once more, this time he allowed his blood pressure to rise. Unable to form a kill box, he took an offensive stance. With the abyss unable to be an extension of his limbs, he was prepared to be absolutely ruthless. Deicide pulled his lips back, baring his sharpened teeth. A frigid breath escaped from his jaws as he tightened his fists. The small well of vestige material still inside his reserve bladder began to spill into his system, and his veins bulged as they ran black. The man rushed him, but the fusion of Deicide and the abyss could sense that Arkadair had long since run out of vestige materials in his own veins. He tried to block Deicide's attacks, but the punches crashed through his defenses. Arkadair backpedaled into the dais, causing him to stumble, just as Deicide grabbed him by his throat and tore the man's lower jaw away from his face. He stood there, holding the flailing man, bleeding profusely from the toothed hole in his face. Though famished, Deicide hesitated, taking a bite. Just then the abyss emerged from the gash in his stomach and devoured the jawbone that Deicide was still holding, before she gorged herself on the rest of the dying Arkadair, regaining a portion of her size with every bite. Deicide dropped the corpse and allowed the abyss to feed. Noisily she spread her tendrils and began to consume the skin of the man, greedily peeling it from his muscle in long bloody strips, the sound of it like some thick fabric being torn from a giant spool. Deicide tightened his lips as she began to violently yank at the limbs of the body. Joints popped free, muscle was ripped from bone and tendon. Her single giggle turned to several as she chewed and gulped down mounds of flesh, stuffing it in her black maw. There was a series of wet snaps as she wrenched open the rib cage. She carefully incised the arteries surrounding the heart and then gleefully handed it to Deicide, and her large yellow eyes began to smile. Deicide tried to refuse, but the abyss only thrust it further toward his face. This was how their friendship had begun. Just after the naming ceremony, she had crushed the larynx of a goat, or some creature that looked it, and tore out its heart to celebrate. The boy Deicide had been was surely more apprehensive then, not out of any notions of civility, but because of the girl's unwillingness to suppress any urge she had, no matter how violent or sexual, and with her the two always arrived in pairs. At first Deicide thought she had turned out this way from her noble birth, but in her world, nobility was granted through submission of all others, not through the hoarding of resources and wealth, but through violence. It was the right of the powerful to do as they pleased to the lessers. They had no need to insult the intelligence of the common by building falsities called justice. Deicide took hold of the fresh heart, still leaking life fluids, and plunged his teeth into it. His saliva quickly began to break down the flesh as he chewed. The first satisfying swallow would not be enough to replenish the nutrients he had lost fighting, and the abyss goaded him into finishing the rest. It had been ages since he had fed on the flesh of a sentient being. Not developing the halcyonic cider had done away with the eater's need to perform cannibalistic acts for survival. It remained as a mostly ceremonial practice, or was done only to highlight an impressive kill. Still, even here with just the abyss, in this kingdom that had become his prison, Deicide felt a bit of shame for consuming the man, even if he only did so for survival.